June 6th, 1944. Before dawn. Along the Normandy coast, the air is wet and heavy, salt clinging to concrete and steel. The sea is a dark sheet, broken only by a low, restless swell. Somewhere inland, a field gun sits cold, its barrel angled toward coordinates already inked on range cards, numbers that have meant nothing for months. At a German observation post above the beaches, Major Werner Pluskat watches the horizon through the slit of a fortified position. He is an artilleryman, trained to turn distant shapes into fire missions. The night has been full of rumours, air activity, scattered reports, the uneasy sense that something is finally moving. But rumours are common on this coast. Then the darkness begins to thin, and the ocean changes. Where there should be empty water, there are silhouettes, lines, mass, a horizon that seems to fill with ships. In that first grey light, Pluskat is among the first German officers to truly see what is coming, and his sighting will collide with a Western front built on assumptions, delays, and a command system that cannot move as fast as the tide. By the time the tide turned on the Normandy coast, the Third Reich was already fighting with its back to several walls at once. In the east, the Wehrmacht had been bleeding since Stalingrad. Through 1943, German armies reeled from Kursk and the Soviet counteroffensives that followed. In the south, the Allies had landed in Sicily in July 1943 and on the Italian mainland that September. Italy became a grinding front of mountains and rivers, another mouth to feed, another place where German formations were consumed. And over Germany itself, the war arrived every night. The Allied strategic bombing campaign intensified into 1943 and 1944, forcing Germany into a constant state of emergency: fighter production, flak belts, repair work, dispersal, men, guns, fuel, concrete, rail capacity. Everything became a competition between fronts. Even in France, far from the Eastern Front's collapse and Italy's attrition, the German garrison felt the strain as shortages became routine rather than exceptional. Yet France mattered. It was the locked door to the Reich's western flank. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command understood the logic. The Anglo-Americans would not fight forever in the Mediterranean. A cross-channel landing was the direct road into France and then into Germany. The question was not whether the invasion would come, but where, and whether it could be stopped at the shoreline before Allied manpower and logistics turned a beachhead into a continent-wide front. Germany's answer was the Atlantic Wall. On maps and in propaganda, it looked like a continuous rampart from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. On the ground, it was a patchwork: strong points, gun batteries, obstacles, minefields, flooded lowlands, and concrete casemates built under urgent orders, often by organisation tot and forced labour. Some sectors were truly formidable. Others were thin, improvised, or incomplete. The coastline was vast. The available resources were not. The German army in the West also had a specific problem: the quality and mobility of its infantry. Many coastal units were static divisions, short on transport, short on modern heavy weapons, tasked to hold fixed positions. Their personnel could include older soldiers, men recovering from wounds, and contingents of foreign volunteers or conscripts grouped into so-called Erste battalions. They could fight, often stubbornly, but they were not designed to manoeuvre fast across shattered roads under air attack. The Atlantic Wall assumed the enemy would be met by a web of fire and concrete, but concrete could not counterattack. That task belonged to armour. And in early 1944, the German command in the West was split over how armour should be used. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, Arb West, argued for a central reserve: keep Panzer divisions back from the coast, preserve them from naval gunfire and airstrikes, and then launch a concentrated counterattack once the main landing area was identified. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to oversee coastal defences as Inspector of Fortifications and later commanding Army Group B, saw a different battlefield. Rommel had watched Allied air power in North Africa. He believed that once the invasion began, roads and open ground would become killing zones. If panzer divisions waited too far inland, they might never arrive intact. In Rommel's view, the decisive battle would be fought in the first hours, at the waterline, under the first wave, before the Allies could unload tanks, artillery, and fuel. It was a debate about time measured in minutes. The German system for releasing armoured reserves made that time even more precious. Key panzer formations in France were held as a strategic reserve whose commitment required approval from the highest level, Hitler himself. In practice, that meant a command chain that could hesitate when the battlefield demanded reflex. Reports had to climb. Decisions had to descend, and any uncertainty about the main landing site could freeze movement. Meanwhile, uncertainty was exactly what Germany lived with. The most obvious invasion point, shortest crossing, best ports, quickest route into northern France, was the Pass de Calais. German planners knew it. Allied planners knew Germany knew it. The result was a gravitational pull in German deployments and expectations. The 15th Army guarded the Calais sector heavily. Normandy, farther west, appeared less likely. Its beaches were usable, but the coast was longer, the approach more complex, and major port facilities were not immediately available. Normandy became, in German eyes, a place where something might happen, just not where everything would happen. That perception shaped how units were positioned, how fortifications were prioritised, and how commanders interpreted warning signs. In the spring of 1944, the coast endured constant Allied air pressure and intermittent raids, and German sentries learned an exhausting lesson. Many alarms led nowhere. The human mind adapts to false starts. It becomes careful with certainty. Along the Channel and the Norman shoreline, guns waited in their emplacements. Range tables were checked, telephone lines were tested and retested, observation posts scanned the sea. The men on watch lived between boredom and dread, because either could kill you. Boredom made you careless. Dread made you see invasions in every shadow. In the end, the war in the West came down to small places. Individual batteries, individual strongpoints, individual officers, staring out through narrow slits of reinforced concrete, responsible for turning the first sighting into the first action. And on one stretch of Normandy coast, that responsibility would settle on a particular artillery sector, quiet on most days, but positioned to look directly into the grey seam where sea meets sky. Across the Channel, the war was being assembled like an industrial product, quietly, relentlessly, and at a scale Europe had never seen. By early 1944, southern England had become a vast staging ground. Airfields crowded with fighters, bombers, and troop carriers. Roads thick with convoys moving at night. Camps hidden in woods. Harbours packed with landing craft. The plan was Operation Overlord, with its naval assault phase. Operation Neptune, designed to put 5 assault divisions onto the beaches of Normandy, while airborne divisions dropped behind the coast to block German movement and seize key crossings. The Allies had learned hard lessons in earlier landings. In North Africa, Sicily and Italy, they had seen what happened when an invasion force hesitated. In France, hesitation was not an option. A lodgement had to be seized quickly, then expanded into a continuous front before German armour could concentrate and crush it. But Overlord had a vulnerability that no amount of steel could erase. It required surprise long enough to get the first waves ashore. To protect that surprise, the Allies built a second operation made of shadows. Deception, misdirection, the campaign later known broadly as Operation Bodyguard, most famously Fortitude, worked to keep German attention fixed on the Pass de Calais, not simply through rumours, but through controlled signals traffic, physical decoys and the careful use of double agents who fed German intelligence what it already expected to be true, that the main blow would fall on the shortest crossing under a well-known American commander, George S. Patton, at the head of a fictitious force. It was an effort to shape not only German deployments, but German interpretation. Even when evidence appeared, it could be read as a feint. In Normandy itself, this mattered because the defence was both stronger and weaker than Allied planners could fully measure. On paper, much of the coastal sector facing the American landings had been assigned to the 716th Infantry Division, a static formation spread thin along a long coastline. Its bunkers and strongpoints were real, and the fields behind the beaches were mined and wired. But static divisions were limited in mobility and often short of the kind of depth that could absorb a major assault. Then in early 1944, a tougher unit entered the picture. The 352nd Infantry Division arrived in the area and began to assume responsibility for key stretches of the coast, including ground overlooking what the Allies would call Omaha Beach. The 352nd was not an elite division in the romantic sense, but it was more capable than many of the formations holding the Atlantic Wall. It contained a significant cadre of experienced officers and men. It brought additional artillery and a more coherent, defensive posture. For the Americans who would come ashore, that difference would be measured in minutes and meters. This shift in German order of battle became one of the most consequential details of D-Day's first day, because Omaha's defences, already menacing on the map, now had more disciplined manpower behind them. The terrain amplified everything. Omaha was not a flat ribbon of sand. Behind the waterline rose bluffs and ridgelines cut by draws, narrow exits that could be blocked and covered by intersecting fire. Concrete emplacements and field positions were placed to exploit those angles. Machine guns did not need to be everywhere. They needed to be where a man would run when the beach turned lethal. Artillery did not need to hit individual soldiers. It needed to churn the beach and the approaches, disrupt timing, and force the assault to stall under observation. And observation was the key. For German artillery, the coast was not just a boundary, it was a range fan. This is where Major Werner Pluskat enters the story with clarity. Pluskat was an artillery officer of the German army, serving with the 352nd Infantry Division's artillery regiment. By June 1944, he commanded Battalion, Artillery Regiment 352, one of the formations responsible for delivering indirect fire in support of the coastal defenders. His work was methodical, plotting targets, coordinating battery positions, maintaining firing data, and crucially using observers to see what maps could not. On the Atlantic Wall, an observer could decide how fast a battery fought and whether it fought at all. Range cards and pre-registered targets mattered, but the first hours of an invasion would bring smoke, confusion, damaged lines, and rapidly shifting points of impact. An observer with a clear view could turn chaos into coordinates. Pluskat's position on the morning of June 6th, at an observation post overlooking the sea in the Omaha sector, gave him exactly what thousands of other German soldiers did not have at that instant: a wide, unobstructed horizon. It was not a heroic perch. It was a professional one, a place built for one purpose: to spot enemy movement and translate it into fire. In the last hours before the landings, that coast lived in uncertainty. German command expected an invasion, but not certainty of its hour. Patrols reported signs and then lost them again in darkness. Allied air attacks and bombardments strained communications. The weather, wind, cloud, sea state, made prediction harder for both sides. Then slowly, the horizon began to lighten, and for the men whose duty was to watch the water, the coming day was about to stop being theoretical. The sea would become crowded. The silence would become layered with engines and shell fire, and one artillery major, trained to read distance and intent through glass, would find himself looking at a sight so vast that it seemed to redraw the edge of the world. Angle 1. Human. The weight of watching for months, the Normandy coast trained its defenders in a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of continuous combat, but the slow grind of readiness, boots on concrete, eyes on water, ears tuned for an engine note that might mean nothing at all. Major Werner Pluskat lived inside that rhythm. An artillery officer does not have the luxury of guessing. He is expected to be precise when everyone else is frightened, and calm when others are shouting into telephones that may already be dead. Day after day, the ocean remained an empty plain. Night after night, alerts came and faded. Allied aircraft passed overhead. Bombs fell elsewhere. Reports arrived that were half-heard and hard to verify. False alarms are not harmless. They change people. The first time a warning comes, men tighten their straps and grip their rifles. After the 10th time, some begin to doubt their own fear. A coastal war like this can lull even disciplined troops into a dangerous economy of belief, saving certainty for a moment that never seems to arrive. Pluskat's job fought against that human tendency. His battalion's guns existed for a single, unrepeatable purpose. When the invasion came, The first minutes would be the minutes that mattered most. He had to be the kind of officer who did not waste time on theatre, but also did not dismiss a signal just because the last one had been wrong. On the morning of June 6th, he would not be meeting the enemy face to face. He would meet it through distance, through glass, through bearings, through the thin line between a calm report and a warning that arrives too late. And in the dark before dawn, that line narrowed to the width of an observation slit aimed at the sea. Angle 2, tactical, how a coastal artilleryman fights an invasion from the outside. The Atlantic wall looked like concrete and steel. From inside, it was a system, an interlocking set of firing plans built on pre-registered targets and rapid communication. German coastal and field artillery in Normandy relied on preparation. Batteries had firing data calculated in advance for likely target areas. The surf line, beach exits, road junctions, gaps in hedgerows, and assembly areas behind the dunes. Observers watched from elevated points and directed corrections. The process could be swift when everything worked. Identify a target, relay bearings and estimated range, order a fire mission, adjust rounds by observation, then concentrate fire where it hurt most. But D-Day was designed to break that system. Naval gunfire and aerial bombing were not only meant to destroy guns. They were meant to shatter communications, cut landlines, collapse command posts, bury switchboards and force units into isolated pockets where coordination became guesswork. Even a well-sighted battery could become tactically blind if its observer was pinned down or if the telephone network failed. The tactical truth of that morning was cruelly simple. Artillery could kill in bulk, but only if it could see and speak. Pluskat's role placed him at the hinge of that system. As a battalion commander, he had guns that could reach key areas of the shoreline and approaches behind it. His observation post was not a dramatic command throne. It was an instrument built to locate targets and feed the numbers into a chain that ended in steel and explosions. When the invasion fleet finally appeared, it would not be enough to know it was there. The question would be, where are the landing waves aiming, which sectors are thickening, and how fast can fire be shifted before smoke and naval counter-battery make the coast unreadable? That was the tactical contest waiting for daylight. Angle 3, technology. Seeing still matters when wires break by 1944. The war in the air and at sea was saturated with technology. Radar, radio, encrypted traffic, aerial reconnaissance. Yet on the Normandy coast, the most decisive sensor in the opening minutes could still be a pair of human eyes. Germany did have radar coverage along parts of the French coast, and reports could be generated from distant contacts. But D-Day's opening was shaped by disruption, Allied air attacks, the complexity of the channel at night, and the simple difficulty of turning detection into immediate action. Radar could suggest that something was moving. It could not always tell a local commander what mattered most, exactly which stretch of shoreline would be struck first, and with how much mass. Communications technology was just as fragile. German coastal defence depended heavily on landlines, field telephones connecting strongpoints, artillery command posts and higher headquarters. Those lines were vulnerable to bombing and shelling, and once they were cut, units were pushed toward radios that were fewer in number, subject to interference, and often constrained by procedure and hierarchy. In that environment, a visual confirmation became priceless. A clear sighting could cut through uncertainty in a way that a fragmentary message could not. It carried authority. Ships on the horizon were not a rumour, not a misread intercept, not an anxious interpretation of distant engine noise. They were shape and scale, an invasion made visible. This is why the first light of June 6th mattered so much. As the sky paled, as the sea stopped being a blank, details began to form, silhouettes where there should have been nothing at all, and the difference between a possible and a happening became impossible to ignore. Angle 4. Leadership command. Minutes lost in a system built to obey what Major Pluskat saw at the shoreline had to become action inland, and in the German West, action moved through layers. At the top sat a divided defensive philosophy. Rundstedt wanted armour held back, then thrown in as a single fist. Rommel wanted armour close enough to strike while the invaders were still vulnerable on the sand. Between them was not just a disagreement, it was a compromise that satisfied neither. The compromise had a fatal feature. Key panzer formations were not purely tactical tools. They were political and strategic assets held under centralized control. In practice, that meant that the decision to release major armoured reserves could depend on approvals far from the beaches, filtered through staff officers and competing assessments of where the real invasion was. On the morning of June 6th, this produced a kind of paralysis that no individual officer on the coast could solve. Reports arrived from multiple points: airborne landings inland, naval bombardment, amphibious assault. It was exactly the kind of mixed picture deception plans were designed to create. Enough evidence to force movement, but enough uncertainty to delay commit. So even when the invasion became visible from posts like Pluskat, the German response did not instantly become coherent. Some local counterattacks were launched by units already in place. Others waited for orders that moved slowly through disrupted communications. The men in bunkers and trenches fought immediately because they had no choice. The men who could shift the battle, large mobile reserves, were trapped for crucial hours in the logic of permission, and while the decision climbed and fell through headquarters, the sea kept filling. Angle 5, enemy. What the armada looked like from the shore from the Allied side, Overlord was a carefully timed machine. From the German side, it first appeared as a physical impossibility. In darkness, the channel can hide almost anything. In daylight, it reveals scale with merciless clarity. As morning light spread across the water, the horizon off Normandy did not simply show ships. It showed depth, multiple lines, shapes behind shapes, a layered formation that seemed to extend beyond what the eye could count. Warships sat lower and heavier, bristling with purpose. In front of them, smaller vessels moved in patterns that only made sense when understood as a landing plan, waves being built, aligned and pushed toward precise sectors of sand. The sea surface began to look crowded, then crowded beyond comprehension. This is the moment that later lodged in German memory. Pluskat would later describe the shock of seeing the fleet, an ocean that appeared filled as far as the eye could see. A sight so overwhelming it felt less like a raid and more like geography changing. And from a shore position, the psychological effect cut two ways. The scale could induce dread because no single battery could stop it, but it could also produce a grim clarity. A defender no longer had to guess if today was the day. He only had to decide how to spend the minutes he had left before the first wave reached the shallows. The armada was not just coming. It was already there, pressing in with the tide. Angle 6, moral civilian. A battlefield built inside ordinary life, the Atlantic Wall was not erected on empty ground. It was built into farms, villages, and coastal towns where French civilians still lived under occupation. Concrete appeared beside fields. Wire and mines cut across paths that had existed for generations. Beaches that once meant fishing in summer became restricted zones, patrolled and punished. Construction drew on requisitioned materials and forced labour, and entire stretches of coastline were transformed into military geometry. Angles of fire imposed on ordinary places. By June 1944, many civilians near the coast had already learned to fear Allied air raids and bombardment as much as they feared German authority. Bridges and rail lines were attacked to isolate the battlefield. Roads were cratered, trains burned. The preparation for liberation came with destruction first, because military logic demanded it. When the invasion began, that moral collision tightened. Naval shells and bombs did not distinguish between a gun position and the house built too near it. A German strongpoint could turn a nearby hamlet into a target. A church tower could become an observation point, and therefore a threat. Civilians hid in cellars while the earth shook above them, caught between an occupier fighting for survival and an invader fighting to break through. This is part of the coast Pluskat watched from his post. Not a blank military stage, but a lived, in landscape about to be torn open. And as the silhouettes offshore sharpened into undeniable fleets, that landscape, soldiers and civilians alike, entered the first irreversible hour. June 6, 1944 begins without a sunrise anyone will remember as beautiful. Before first light, the Normandy coast is already vibrating with signals. Not clear messages, fragments, a sense of pressure building offshore and inland at the same time. The beaches they have ranged and plotted are now being approached exactly the way their firing plans imagined, except on a scale that turns every firing solution into a drop of water against a flood. Then the first assault waves near the surf. The sea around Omaha is rougher than planners wanted. Many American amphibious Sherman DD tanks, launched offshore to swim in under their canvas screens, are overwhelmed by the swells and sink before reaching the beach. Infantry landing craft drift under wind and current. Formations loosen. Units land in the wrong sectors, sometimes directly in front of strong points that were meant to be avoided. The German defensive system, imperfect but prepared, begins to bite. Machine guns open with long, controlled bursts from positions covering the draws and shingle. Mortars drop rounds into the surf zone and the upper beach. Field artillery, where observers and communications still function, works to place fire onto crowded approaches. The effect is immediate congestion. Men pinned behind obstacles, pinned against the shingle, pinned by the simple fact that there is nowhere to go except forward, and forward is rising ground under observation. Omaha becomes, within minutes, a struggle to move at all. Through smoke and salt spray, Pluskat's world compresses into the essentials of his profession. What can be seen? What can be communicated? What can be hit? If his battalion can keep firing, it can disrupt the timing that the entire invasion depends on. But Allied naval fire is already adjusting, hunting muzzle flashes and suspected observation points, trying to blind the coast so that no German officer, no matter how trained, can keep a steady eye on the killing ground. By mid-morning, the air above the bluffs is no longer clean. It is dust, smoke, cordite and pulverized earth. And in that thickening haze, the battle is about to shift from the waterline to the high ground, where a few small breakthroughs in a few narrow draws will begin to decide whether the Atlantic wall holds or starts to crack. By mid-morning, Omaha is no longer a landing. It is a stalled mechanism, men and metal jammed against the shore, pinned under angles of fire that the German defenders built for exactly this hour. On the bluffs above the beach, the defenders fight in compartments, concrete rooms, earthen trenches, weapon pits dug into the slopes, a battlefield of narrow sightlines where a machine gun can dominate a draw and an artillery observer can turn a patch of sand into a registered target. For Major Werner Pluskat, the morning becomes a struggle to keep the artillery war alive. If he can still see, he can still correct fire. If he can still communicate, the guns can still be shifted. But the sea has an answer for every muzzle flash. American naval gunfire is not simply pounding the coast in bulk anymore, it is hunting. It searches for strong points that continue to fire, for suspected observation posts, for any position that seems to be directing artillery. As the hours pass, the offshore warships begin to close in. Destroyers, smaller and more agile than the big ships farther out, push toward the shallows until they are operating dangerously near the coast, close enough to engage targets on the bluffs with direct, rapid fire. It is a calculated risk. Mines, shallow water, and potential shore batteries make it hazardous, but the beach is choking. And the men on the sand need something immediate. From the German side, the effect is suffocating. A strong point might survive a distant bombardment, then be torn apart by shells arriving flatter, faster, and more accurately. A trench line that had dominated the beach at 7-0 can be half-buried and silent by 10-0. An observation slit that once framed the surf can become a death sentence when the glass reflects light, or when the pattern of fire suggests exactly where the watcher must be. The German defenders do not collapse all at once. They fracture. Some weapons crews continue firing until they are killed or their guns are destroyed. Others fight until ammunition runs low, then shift positions, turning into infantry in a maze of wire and craters. Small groups become isolated, still dangerous, but increasingly cut off from orders and from each other. In the draws leading off Omaha, the Americans begin to find their first narrow ways upward. The struggle is not clean. It is not synchronized. It is often accidental. Men sheltering in a fold of ground, then discovering a gap in wire. A strong point suppressed by naval fire just long enough for a few to sprint. Engineers cutting passages through obstacles under direct fire. Infantry using smoke, dead ground, and the simple fact of numbers to push into places where earlier movement meant death. Rangers and infantry units probe the edges and the seams. Small assaults form around whoever can lead at that moment. Junior officers, non-commissioned officers, any man who can point and move. By late morning into early afternoon, these small actions begin to connect, not into a grand breakthrough, but into a series of thin cracks. And cracks are all an invasion needs. For the German side, the most urgent hope is counterattack. Throw the Americans back into the surf before they can climb the high ground and bring their own weapons inland. Elements of the 352nd Infantry Division attempt to organise local counter-thrusts using troops positioned behind the coast. But the battlefield that morning punishes movement. Allied air power dominates daylight roads and open fields. Naval gunfire reaches inland farther than the German defenders once imagined it could. Communications are inconsistent. Some lines cut, some radios overloaded, headquarters receiving overlapping reports from multiple sectors. Units sent forward can find themselves moving into shellfire and confusion, struggling to locate the exact points where the enemy is breaking through. Pluskat's world, built on coordination, becomes increasingly unstable. Even when guns are physically able to fire, ammunition supply is not infinite, and resupply is dangerous. Even when a forward observer still has eyes on a target, passing that information to batteries can be slowed by damaged lines and disrupted command posts. The artillery fight becomes intermittent, bursts of effective fire, then silence, then fire again, each pause giving the Americans another few meters. On the beach below, the Americans begin to push beyond the shingle. Small groups climb the bluffs using draws and improvised routes. They reach the top and begin to fight for the ridgeline. Once that happens, the German defenders lose something that cannot be rebuilt in the middle of a day: the ability to dominate the beach from above with uninterrupted fire. In the early afternoon, American forces start to secure sections of high ground and expand laterally, linking footholds. German positions that had been deadly at dawn are now being threatened from behind or from the flank. Some hold, some are overrun. Some withdraw in small groups to secondary lines, fighting from hedgerows and field boundaries. By late afternoon, Omaha is still violent and uncertain, but it is no longer a question of whether Americans will remain on the sand. The question becomes whether the Germans can contain them before the beachhead thickens into depth. Before more troops, more artillery, more vehicles, more radios, and more ammunition turn a precarious foothold into a stable front. For Pluskat, the day's meaning hardens into a single realization. He had seen the armada first light could reveal. He had tried to turn sight into response. But now, as the battle spreads inland and the shore positions are pounded into fragments, the size of the invasion becomes a fact that cannot be reported away or counterattacked back into the sea. Evening approaches with smoke still hanging over the coast. The sound of guns does not stop. It simply changes rhythm, less the sudden violence of first contact, more the steady percussion of a front being built. And when darkness finally returns, it brings no relief. Only the understanding that the invasion has survived its most vulnerable day, and the next fight will be for Normandy itself. Night falls on June 6, 1944, without darkness ever feeling complete. The beaches still burn in places. Wrecked landing craft lie at odd angles where the tide left them. Flares rise and fall. Offshore, ships keep their stations, silhouettes against a low sky, while the water between ship and shore stays busy with the endless work that follows survival, bringing in the next loads, the next men, the next crates of ammunition and radio parts, and medical supplies. For the Germans along the Normandy coast, the first day ends in fragments. Some strongpoints that had fought all morning are now silent, destroyed by naval gunfire, abandoned when they were outflanked, or cut off until surrender becomes inevitable. Other positions remain alive, still capable of sudden bursts of fire, still able to kill, but no longer part of a clean defensive line. The Atlantic wall in this sector has not been broken like a single gate. It has been cracked in several places at once, and the cracks are widening. Behind the beaches, German movement becomes a desperate argument with geography and air power. Roads that look short on a map run through hedgerows and narrow lanes. Bridges and junctions have been attacked for weeks. Allied aircraft, Fighter, bombers, reconnaissance turn daylight travel into risk. A battalion that tries to shift position can arrive late, broken up, or without the heavy weapons it assumed would follow. In many places, the counterattacks that German doctrine expects are reduced to local actions, company-sized thrusts, squads probing with grenades and machine guns, attempts to restore a line that is already changing shape. At Omaha, the price of the first day is written in the sand and on the bluff. American casualties, though, are heavy, commonly placed in the low thousands, often cited around 2,000 or more, depending on accounting methods and unit records. Across all 5 invasion beaches and the airborne drops, Allied losses on D-Day are generally estimated at roughly 10,000 casualties, with about 4,400 killed. German losses are harder to pin down precisely. Records are uneven, units are shattered, and many men vanish into capture or the confusion of retreat. But they are significant, especially in the formations directly engaged along the beaches and in the airborne landing areas. Numbers matter, but they do not explain the feeling that spreads through German commands that night. The sensation that time has tilted. Before June 6th, the German defensive problem in the West is theoretical, an invasion expected, planned for, argued over. After June 6th, it is physical. It has weight. It has a front line that must be fed with ammunition and orders through a landscape that is already under Allied observation. And for German artillerymen like Major Werner Pluskat, the night brings a cold calculation. Artillery is not only about guns. It is about networks, observers, lines, range tables, supply routes, command posts that can still talk to each other. D-Day is a deliberate assault on those networks. If a battery loses its forward observer, it loses the ability to adjust fire onto moving target. If telephone lines are cut, a battalion commander can become a man with guns and no voice. If ammunition columns cannot move, the best firing data in the world becomes useless paper. By the morning of June 7th, the Allies begin to tighten what they have gained. They push to link beach exits, widen the lodgement, and connect separate footholds into something that can endure. Omaha's breakout grows from scattered groups into more continuous positions. Units reorganize. Engineers clear lanes. Artillery is hauled ashore and emplaced. The invasion stops being an event and becomes a process, methodical, accumulating, hard to reverse. For the German side, the immediate aim, throw them back into the sea, has already started to slip away. Not because every defender has been defeated, but because the window for a decisive counterstroke is closing with every hour more men and material come ashore. And as that window narrows, the story of what Pluskat saw first, an armada forming on the horizon, begins to reveal its deeper irony. Seeing was only the beginning, and the days that follow will show how little a single clear sighting can matter once an entire campaign is in motion. In the days after June 6th, the shoreline stops being the edge of the war and becomes its supply line. What the Allies lacked on D-Day, space, depth and time, they begin to manufacture through sheer throughput. More infantry divisions come in, more artillery, more engineers. Tanks that could not swim in heavy seas are landed directly. Fuel and ammunition are stacked in dunes and fields that were killing grounds a week earlier. The beachhead becomes a working port without a harbour, sustained by constant movement and constant risk. For the German side, the problem changes shape just as fast. Normandy is not open country. It is hedgerows, sunken lanes, small fields, folds in the land that hide defenders until a squad is almost on top of them. For German infantry, this terrain offers short-range killing power and the chance to slow a larger force. For German commanders, it offers something else. It breaks the battlefield into hundreds of small fights that consume reserves one company at a time. In June and July, the campaign becomes attrition, keen contested in the east under British and Canadian pressure, and the American sectors in the west grinding forward through the bocage toward Cherbourg and the road network beyond. Every day the Allies hold air superiority, German movement becomes more expensive. Every day the Allies land more material, the chance of pushing them back shrinks. Germany does commit armoured forces in Normandy, but the commitment arrives in a pattern that favours the attacker's strengths: piecemeal movement under air attack, limited fuel, scattered counterattacks that can be blunted by artillery and fighter bombers, and a front that steadily thickens with Allied logistics. By late July 1944, the Western Front reaches its breaking point. Operation Cobra, an American breakout offensive, ruptures the German line in the west. Once the line is cracked, the war becomes mobile again, and mobility favours the side with fuel, air cover, and intact communications. German units begin withdrawing under pressure, trying to form new lines while being pressed from multiple directions. In August, the retreat turns into a trap. The battles around the Falaise pocket do not destroy every German formation in Normandy, but they shatter cohesion. Men escape, but equipment is abandoned. Artillery pieces are lost. Vehicles burn along roads crowded with the remnants of divisions that entered Normandy as organised units and leave it as columns of survivors. For the soldiers who fought on June 6th, those who had tried to hold the coast with planned fires and fixed defences, the later weeks are a different kind of war. Less prepared, more improvised, more desperate, the Atlantic Wall's logic is gone. The fight becomes one of delaying actions and shrinking options. Major Werner Pluskat survives that transformation. His D-Day experience follows him, because it is a moment of pure clarity inside a campaign defined by confusion, the instant when the horizon fills and the question of if disappears forever. He would later recount the shock of the sight, an armada that seemed to cover the sea, because there are few military experiences more humbling than watching an enemy arrive with overwhelming mass and knowing that your tools, no matter how well handled, cannot change the scale of what is coming. Pluskat's name becomes widely known after the war for another reason too: the way D-Day was translated into public memory. In 1962, the film The Longest Day portrayed a German major at an observation post spotting the invasion fleet, an image that fixed the idea of a seeing first into popular culture. The scene is dramatised for cinema, but it points to a real historical truth. German officers on the coast did observe the armada at first light, and their reports raced into a command system that struggled to respond with matching speed. That is the final irony embedded in Pluskat's story. On June 6th, information was not absent. In places, it was immediate, visual, undeniable. Yet the ability to act on it, quickly, currently, at the level that might change outcomes, was constrained by hierarchy, disruption, and a defensive plan caught between competing theories of war. And when the guns finally fall quiet on that stretch of coast, the sea returns to being an empty horizon. But it is an emptiness that never again means safety. Only the memory of how quickly a single dawn can redraw the world. In war, there is a difference between knowing and understanding. The German command in France knew an invasion was coming. It had been discussed in headquarters, printed in orders, poured into concrete along the coast. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, understanding arrived in a form that no staff map could provide. An armada occupying the horizon, the sea turned into a moving front line. Major Werner Pluskat's place in that morning is not the romance of a lone witness. It is the reality of a professional eye doing professional work. He watched, he identified, he reported. In the logic of modern war, that should have triggered rapid movement, reserves released, counterattacks organised, a system pivoting on verified information. Instead, Dye exposed a harsher truth about armies. The speed of a response is not set by the man who sees first, but by the machinery above him. By 1944, Germany's western defence was a compromise between Rommel's demand for immediate action at the shoreline and Rundstedt's insistence on holding armour back, between local urgency and centralised permission, and damaged communications, overlapping reports, and the persistent expectation that the decisive blow might still come at Calais, and the invasion's first hours became a test Germany was structurally unprepared to pass. Pluskat's sighting endures because it captures something universal. A single human being can recognise history in an instant and still be powerless to stop it. The first clear view of the fleet did not change what the Allies had built in Britain, nor what they carried across the Channel in thousands of hulls. It only marked the point when denial was no longer possible. Long after the smoke cleared, D-Day would become memorialized in films, photographs and ceremonies. Yet behind the familiar images lies a quieter lesson. Modern war is decided not only by courage and firepower, but by perception, communication and time, measured in minutes that cannot be recovered once they are lost. And on that Normandy dawn, the sea did what it had always done, brought the tide in. Only this time it brought an army with it.